Throughout World War II, the best of the best, the top guns of their day, were the aces of every nation. The aces, men who could claim 5 or more planes to their credit, rose to fame through their amazing exploits in aerial combat. By war's end, only 3% of all fighter pilots could claim ace status. Those 3% accounted for almost 50% of all the air-to-air victories scored between 1939 and 1945. How did they achieve such success? Clearly, an ace was a breed apart, a man who combined extraordinary flying skill with courage, keen eyesight, and savvy tactics. Those who lived through their combat experiences were usually the most calculating of all. The men who balanced risk-taking with a cool, professional understanding of their aircraft and the capabilities of the enemies. The best aces chose their tactics based on those two factors, combined with the position they found themselves in at the start of a fight. Fighter tactics in World War II underwent a radical transformation by the time VE Day brought the fighting to a close. As much as air fighting changed, however, the basic elements remained a constant. In fact, all the basic tactical foundations had long since been laid in World War I. But it took time for those lessons to be relearned once Hitler's rampage in Europe began 20 years later.
During World War I, air combat tactics evolved into two basic elements in the fighting over the Western Front. The first was the traditional swirling, turning dogfight that you see in all the World War I type air combat movies. But the Germans developed a real specialized tactic by 1918 to preserve their small fighter force on the Western Front. This was the hit-and-run tactic. They were able to dive into opposing formations, hit them, and then run away as fast as they could by high-speed dives. Well, during the 1930s, both of these elements of air-to-air combat were really lost as tacticians and theorists concluded that dogfighting was a thing of the past because of the high speeds that new fighter aircraft were capable of achieving.
The RAF was probably the most heavily influenced by that argument. Instead of focusing on air-to-air combat between fighters, it developed a wide array of rigid tactics designed to mass the firepower of a fighter formation onto bombers. Fighters in the RAF were considered interceptors, not air superiority weapons.
The mass attack tactics developed by the RAF during the interwar period proved to be an utter catastrophe during the initial stages of the Second World War. The main reason for this was the fact that when flying in these tight formations, only the squadron leader or the flight leader would actually be looking around for enemy aircraft. Everybody else was so busy flying wing on the other aircraft in the formation that they didn't have the opportunity to be looking for enemy aircraft. Consequently, they were constantly surprised and aircraft were lost that probably wouldn't have been lost had they been flying in looser formations. The other issue was the fact that taking these unwieldy, large, cumbersome formations and trying to maneuver them in a very, very fast dogfighting environment proved to be incompatible with the realities of modern air warfare.
If the RAF entered the war with deliberate and rigid tactics, the Luftwaffe took the opposite approach. The war in Spain taught the Luftwaffe to heed the lessons of World War I. They developed loose formations of 4 planes each called a swarm, with 2 plane elements called routes. They were flexible and allowed the pilots enough room so they could be looking around for enemy aircraft. As the British came up their learning curve, they gradually abandoned their pre-war tactics in favor of modified German formations. Originally, RAF squadrons flew 3-plane Vics or Vs, where the leader flew with 2 wingmen tucked in tight behind him. By early 1941, the British had developed a 6-plane formation that was much looser and effective. It was a variation on this formation that the RAF taught to newly formed American squadrons that joined the fight against the Luftwaffe in 1942.
Basically, the British formation that we used was a box formation. A leader, a wingman behind him and slightly off to the side, element leader, and his wingman off a little bit to the side, almost a box.
From the RAF tactics that the U.S. Army Air Force inherited in North Africa and also in the early days in England, the pilots, the fighter pilots, the American fighter pilots, developed a new formation that they called the Finger Four. And it's very similar to the German Schwarm. But imagine 4 planes on the end of each finger, and each fingertip or fingernail representing the aircraft. The leader would be right here, the flight leader. His wingman is this guy right here. The element leader is here, and the element leader's wingman is in trail behind the rest of the formation back here. And the point of this formation was to fly as loose as possible while still being able to provide mutual support. And this way they could all be looking around for enemy aircraft and protect each other at the same time.
As formation styles evolved, so did the fighter pilot's knowledge of how best to employ his aircraft against the enemy. In training before the war, dogfighting had always been considered something of a one-on-one affair. Little effort was made in such encounters for a fighter formation to work as a team. Again, it was the Germans who rediscovered their roots. In Spain, they learned the distinctions between dogfighting styles, hit and run versus a turning fight. A light, agile fighter was found to be best for a turning battle, while faster aircraft with better climbing and diving characteristics proved to be the best hit-and-run style weapons.
The Germans developed the best early war hit-and-run fighter in the Messerschmitt 109. The 109 was capable of amazing vertical maneuvers and performance, and as a result they could dive down on British formations, hit them, make a pass, and climb away with their energy that they had accumulated in the dive, and engage and disengage the British at will, and the early American pilots as well. And this sort of attack caused a lot of losses amongst Allied aircraft and aircrew during the early days and early months of the war. The only thing that the British and the American pilots in 1940, 41, 42 could do was try to break away from these diving attacks and turn. And while that was a fine defensive maneuver, it made them entirely reactive. They could not really retain the initiative or capture the initiative away from this amazing energy fighter.
Anytime you got into a jam, attacked by 109, and they were usually above us, so they'd have the initiative initially. Anytime you were attacked by a 109, about the only thing you could do to keep from getting hit was to get into a tight turn, which he couldn't keep with you. And if you could persuade him to stick with you, you could eventually get around, work into position on his tail.
The Germans could never turn with you. A 109 had a much heavier wing loading, 32 pounds versus the Spitfire's Hurricane's 25. So a German wouldn't be fool enough to try and get on a tight turn with you. You'd nail him. You'd just turn inside him and shoot him. They knew that.
Occasionally, overzealous German pilots would commit a fatal error and attempt to turn fight Allied fighters. Those pilots did not live long.
I spotted a bunch of 109s came down from above us, and heading down toward the targets. Well, I turned my flight up into them and tried to divert them, drive them off, which was kind of silly because there were about six or eight 109s and we were 4 P-40s at that point. Anyway, we got into a big hassle going round and round, and I wound up with 3 of them on my tail, taking turns making passes at me.